Okay, so didn't expect to review a show this dark, but here we are. So let's talk about it. Before I even, get into the details of the show and, like the story of the show, I first of all wanted to touch upon the performance of the character played by the actor Evan Peters. I mean, the way, he portrayed Jeffrey Dahmer in the show just honestly just made it hard for me personally to imagine any other actor even playing the character, probably just because of the way he expressed himself as a character, the kind of clothes he wore, the accent also he speaks in, which was probably also like the accent Jeffrey Dahmer had. And I also say the murders, the way he committed the murders, all of that like really just captured the character of Jeffrey Dahmer. I don't know if it was very accurate, but nonetheless it still like gave that feeling that this is actually Jeffrey Dahmer, this is what Jeffrey Dahmer is like. So for that reason just had to like touch upon the performance of the character before anything else. So here we are now. I think I'll talk about this a little bit later, maybe like when I talk about the story of the show. But I think I had to say how like the way he turned out to be, the way they showed his character, and how he turned out to be the way he was. Well, it was kind of interesting to watch, especially just looking at him from a very young age, and the way he would behave in the public, and the way he would respond to others in a very unusual manner from a very young age was quite appealing to watch, because that way we kind of like get an understanding of where he's coming from, and even also the family. That was also very that also seemed to be a very important factor, just to see the family he grew up in, and just the lack of attention they give him, if that makes sense. At least I personally like from what I observed, he didn't get the attention he needed from his father and mother. In fact, there was a scene where his father Lionel Dahmer also blames him for not like guiding him in the right path. First of all, he didn't pay enough attention to him. And then there's also the scene when Dahmer was about to like turn 18, his father insists him to leave when Dahmer also wasn't really ready to leave to see the real world. And I'm going to touch upon that a little bit later. But I also wanted to definitely talk about how his father showed him how to dissect an animal, a dead animal from a very young age. I felt like that shouldn't have been done in order to like like guide him in the right path. That was definitely a key big factor that clearly influenced Dahmer to uh, head in the path he did, and commit all those murders. So I don't know. I hope I wasn't like just like rambling so much, or just like just randomly like rambling without making any sense. But I really hope like I try to make sense, because it was important that I like brought this up, because after all these were all those key factors they showed in this show. And they also like like basically the whole purpose of showing all these in the show was to show that Jeffrey Dahmer went through all this and thus became the character he was. Now, enough of talking about the character. Now let's talk about the story. I mean, it was a biography show, albeit of an infamous serial killer, so it made sense that they were going to show his backstory and where he eventually ended up in life. But then the way they presented that to the audience was what made it engaging to watch, which is very important to have, and which is what I'm going to talk about. Now, when I was first watching the first episode, and I saw that they caught him towards the end of the episode, I was like, so where are they going to go from here? And honestly speaking, like it was completely fine, honestly, like to start from there, because then later on we didn't see his backstory. Well, in the second episode they do start from his childhood, and we then get to see how messed up his family was, and how he, like I previously mentioned, he wasn't getting the attention he needed. And then there's also that scene which must have influenced him to be the way he was, where his father shows him how to dissect a dead rodent, if I remember correctly, and that's at a very young age. I just felt like he could have waited for that. He didn't have to see it at a very young age, because then he developed an interest of like dissecting bodies from, I think, from there itself. And then it just started to grow on him, because then in high school also we see how he had a passion for that. There was like a particular scene where they show that. And speaking of his high school journey, I wanted to talk about that a bit more, because honestly speaking, his high school journey was what like really like stood out to me for some reason. And I think one of the reason was because we get to learn that he had a passion for science and he was really good at something and could have really done something in his life. And he also does go to university because he was just that good at science, and he probably could have like achieved something there. But then we then see him like have to leave university due to certain reasons, because apparently university did not work out for him. And then you also have sorry about that. And then you also like see him go to the military next, but then that also doesn't work out. And he tries out so many different things, but that none of that worked out. I think the fact that he tried out going to different places but didn't fit into any of them clearly like shaped him to be who he was. Although like that might not have been everything, but that clearly also like impacted the character he was. Now, there's one more key factor, in my opinion, from what I observed, that really, like must have, shaped him to be the character he turned out to be, and that was really just loneliness. Just looking at the, how lonely he truly was, just in a way, like not to like say that what he did was right, but that loneliness must have like clearly led him to the path he went down to. Because there's also one scene where he was like actually there are a couple of scenes, but one scene I wanted to touch upon was like when he calls his father when he's like living up alone in the apartment, and he says how lonely he was and wanted to come live with him. That just clearly showed that he just was feeling very lonely out in the real world without anyone in his life. And that's why like every time he would call people in, he had that like sense that like they were gonna leave him, and that sort of led him to killing them, that and that through like in a very brutal manner. So as like unfortunately that might have been, I think loneliness was a key factor for him to like be the way he turned out to be. So yeah. Now that I've talked about his interest for killing people and how it was developed, it's time to talk about the killings, which was definitely the darkest part of the show. And I have to say, the way they depicted the murders and really the victims of his murders was quite an accurate depiction, and thus really like truly captured the darkness the show was supposed to have, given that the show is after all based on a serial killer. So of course they had to like get it right on with the murders. And honestly speaking, it was disturbing and dark like it was supposed to be, but it was like completely worth it, because after all it was this is what the show's all about. Now, where do I start from? First of all, I have to just say like both the ways, like whether it be the violent ways of killing and or the non-violent ways, which I'll be explaining in a while, both of them were equally dark. In fact, sometimes I really like felt that like the non-violent non-violent murders could get even darker than the violent murders. Victim he does that too, which made me feel the most uncomfortable, was the victim he took to the hotel, that very fancy hotel. And I remember that he adds some kind of drug. I think he got that drug from the military, which he adds to the drink, gives it to him. The next morning you see the victim is, they first of all I think they zoom into his body, like the stomach, then they slowly take it to the chest, and then we finally see his face. But even before we could see his face, the fact that the way the state of his stomach and chest, basically his like like his entire body itself, though the state it was in, from the way it looked, already like made me feel uncomfortable enough, and really made me like realize that it's not going to go in a very nice direction. The victim is probably like like the way the victim is probably going to look, the face of the victim is going to be way more horrifying than his body and chest, or his stomach and chest already was. Because looking at the wound, and honestly I feel like the stomach and chest was somewhat compressed, and that already like gave me a clear idea of like this is not going to go in a very like pretty like direction. Because then when we finally see the face, I think, I believe it was the eyes and then like also the cheeks that were like bleeding. You probably know which scene I'm talking about. Like, don't exactly remember the name of that victim, but you know that scene, where they go to the fancy hotel. That scene definitely made me to feel the most uncomfortable, even though that wasn't even the most violent scene of the show. So it's funny because despite not being the most violent scene of the show, it made me feel uncomfortable enough, and that's pretty much how this show was for most of the part. And another scene that I guess was quite like dark and also quite uncomfortable just thinking about it, even though it had nothing to do with like even though they should don't show any sort of violence in that scene. And that was a scene where he simply takes out a piece of meat from the fridge. Well, at least it looked like it was meat until he cooks it in pan. Well, he does take out the meat, then he cooks it in a pan, and then add some salt and stuff like that. So then he cuts a piece of the meat and he picks it up with a fork. And then the way he was looking at the the piece of meat, it was clear that it was human flesh and not some kind of like red meat or anything like that. Just the way he, I guess he was sort of hesitating, but at least he was staring at it, which made it clear that it was no normal flesh, it was human flesh. So basically he ate nothing but human flesh, which certainly was very uncomfortable and disturbing to watch. Could talk further about what he does after the murder, such as as we all know, of course, there's the dissecting part, then there's also the boiling, then acidifying the bodies, all this kind of stuff you do, which we all know if you have watched the show and watched him do all the things he does after committing his murders. But I think it might just just make this video a bit darker than it should be, so I'll just leave it there. But I do have to say at the end of the day that despite how disturbing the killings can be, and his means of killing his victims, at the end of the day, I think these can the way depicted the killings clearly captured the darkness the show was supposed to have. Got an interesting detail before I wrap this video. So that interesting detail, at least to me, was the fact that he actually picked a neighborhood where he knew the cops wouldn't patrol. That way he could commit his murders without worrying about getting arrested. And initially I did not like notice that, but then later on when they actually mention it in the show, I remember like it was in the court scene or somewhere where I remember like there was one scene where they actually mentioned how he deliberately chose that neighborhood he stayed in because he knew that cops wouldn't patrol the place and that way he could commit the murders. And initially I thought like he just randomly picked some neighborhood, but then when I actually like when they actually mentioned the fact that he actually didn't pick it randomly and he actually picked it on purpose for his own benefit, I just really found it very interesting. So I just really wanted to bring that up mainly because I found it to be an interesting detail. I think the two key aspects that really stood out to me was the portrayal of the character by Evan Peters and the storytelling in the show. Hands down, these two aspects of the show really stood out to me and really what made this show watchable. And that's really all I had for the show. Tell me if I missed anything and what you actually thought about the show and if I could have like elaborated more on anything, because chances are I might have missed out on something which I could have talked about in this video. So please let me know about all that. And as usual, thank you for watching.